Hey everyone, once again, it is Dan Keldsen, the host of Next Future Today and the chief evangelist for Plexicam.com. Today, my guest is Luke Hohmann. He is the chief innovation officer for Applied Frameworks. He's somebody that I've known for at least 10 years or so. I know him primarily from his original, to me, book. It turns out he's written 4 or 5, depending on how you count them. But Innovation Games is the book that really turned me on to what Luke has done with his career, which is sort of, to me, there's a logical connection to his latest book, which is Software Profit Streams, which is really about using relative simple tools on the surface that actually go very deep and help to map out exactly where profit comes from in software specifically. Changing models, licensed versus SaaS and subscription based, or how do you price when new functionality is added on, or maybe new integration like a marketplace or something like that comes along. Of course, if you know me at all, I like to twist tools into using them in different ways. So it's not always, to me, about software profit streams. It's how do you think about profit in general? How do you think about how things should be priced? Do you price against a competitor? Are you pricing for value? Are you pricing as a premium? Things like that. We talk about a whole bunch of things, despite the fact that Software Profit Streams, his latest book, is very specifically about that one area. We do talk about that in this interview, but we talked about a lot of things. We both have experience in user experience, talking about how that impacts how you think about doing software design and how much is too much to worry about for usability, for example, or how do you more rapidly evolve your solution. Luke has a very distinct agile background that he's been pursuing for years and years and years, and is very well known in that community. So there's a lot that we talk about there. How do you write books? They wrote this book by hand, he and his co-author, and sent photos to a designer that turned into a wonderful book along the lines of sort of the legacy of value proposition design, which is the second book after business model generation and business model canvas. So this is very much full of great images and artworks and frameworks that help to sort of support and reduce the need for so many words that a lot of more traditional business books might force you to go through. We cover a lot in this. Luke is very deep and widely read and widely experienced person. So we pursued a whole bunch of tangents that I think you'll find valuable. If you really, really only want to know about software profit streams themselves, you should read the book, go follow what Luke is doing in his company and the services they provide. If you want a bigger context that is sitting within, then I think this interview is probably for you. Let's take a look. Luke, it is so good to see you again. It's been, God, years and years since we were in person, like Las Vegas,
Yeah, Las
2013,
Vegas-ish,
maybe?
and it's kind of fun. Dan, though, you're one of those people I have on my bookshelf, and one of my friends who we have this orbiting kind of thing. Like we come close together, we come far apart, but we're never like not connected.
Yeah, it's funny. When I met you and interviewed you in Vegas back then, I felt that I already knew you because I had read Innovation Games, and I'd found that because 2004, we got acquired. Delphi Group got acquired by Pro Systems, and we were the innovation lab. So I wanted to find out who are the smart people in innovation. And Innovation Games, among other things, it's fun, and there's a lot of super dry innovation stuff out there, or business in general. And just from that, I could sense the sort of vibe of how you work. Plus, I was already an early fan of Agile and Scrum and things like that. So it just made a lot of sense. I felt like when we sat down next to each other with no prep whatsoever, that we just had a great conversation. Sadly, the production company that hired me to do that, they never published the damn interview, but at least we had a good time.
We did have a good time, and it's you can definitely tell it. I think it's partly when people share these deeper values. They share these deeper intellectual values, not just personal values, but just these kind of ways of working. And we talk about that in the Agile community. We talk about, oh, how do I work and what am I doing? And
Right.
But you have to have kind of the underlying value of collaboration, or even the Agile manifesto values.
Yeah.
And when you have those, and when you kind of embody them deeply, people become friends overnight. It's a regular occurrence in the Hohmann household that I'll be, oh, hey, Dan's coming over for dinner. And my wife will be like, who's Dan and where did you meet him? I met him on a plane, or I met him in Vegas. And I was like, and you're inviting them to my home? I'm like, yeah, he's a great guy. And then she's like, okay. And then the family meets someone new and we just have a great time.
I don't think I do that as much anymore, but when I was early on and using LinkedIn, which I thought I'd totally missed, I leveraged using my network that I built up on LinkedIn, and it was fairly, let's say, promiscuous in how I connected with people on LinkedIn, because I thought, why not up the odds that an interesting connection will happen? I took a trip to Denmark to present at a conference, and I was terrified because I didn't speak any Danish. But I had all these connections that knew me mostly because of innovation or Enterprise 2.0 or different things that were like a professional sort of reason to be connected. And I reached out to all those folks, said, hey, for the first time in my life, and I have Danish ancestry, I'm going to come to Denmark. And by the way, do I need to know how to speak Danish? And they said, everybody speaks English. It's not like going to France, for example, where they do speak English, but they want to make you feel terrible. And I got like personal tours of Copenhagen and Aarhus and all sorts of things I would have never stumbled onto. So we share some values in sort of, I don't know, randomness to a certain extent, but being open to experiments and learning new things, which is a major reason why I do this kind of podcast.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. And it is a truism for me too, that I've been fortunate for business to travel the world, and the more I travel, the more I believe that people are fundamentally good, and deep down, we're just humans. Just have that gift of meeting people, and you're like, wow, they're just really nice.
So let's talk about the new book. So, and I didn't realize you've written how many books at this point?
Well, it's funny how we count. I count it as 5. My wife counts it as 4 because one of the books is an ebook only. And she's like, it doesn't count. It's an ebook. And I'm like, it counts. It's an ebook. And so you could count it as 4 or 5, but I'll count it as number 5.
So why write another book? Because you've done it many times before and it's a pain in the ass. So why do this one?
That's a good question. There's a couple of reasons. One is I think people write when they feel that there's almost a calling. When you wrote your book, you were filling a hole. You saw a need in the market, just like any other product or service or solution. I had written a little bit about the interplay between business concerns and technology 20 years ago in my book, Beyond Software Architecture.
Okay.
And I talked a little bit about licensing and things like that. And I realized since then, no one had advanced that body of knowledge. What I like to say is, with great respect, they're all written by boomers for boomers. And so they're super text dense.
Yeah.
There's graphs and charts. And the biggest issue is they treat software like a pen. And so these books have all this advice, and you start to scratch your head and you're like, well, does that really work for a licensed intellectual property? Does that really work when you've got upgrades and there's no law governing the use of my pen? There's no GDPR. There's no California CCPA. There's no HIPAA about the data. And I realized that for software people like us, for people who know technology, our mental model is completely different. Well, and you asked, like, why would I write another book? Well, partly because I like to challenge myself. And I participated in a few exits. So I'm kind of like that standard Silicon Valley entrepreneur. But you still are hungry and you still feel like you can contribute and you're not done yet. And you don't want to retire. I don't want to retire. You create these challenges. And in this book, Jason and I agreed on a couple of challenges. The first challenge was to write a stunningly beautiful book. Now that meant that we needed a great designer, and we found one with Federico Gonzalez Fede. He would take our sketches and he would convert them into the absolutely stunningly, beautifully laid out book that you have in front of you. The second thing is that we wanted to write fewer words. We actually did some research, and what we found is that the average length of books are getting a little longer because people are writing and they're collaborating and they just keep piling on words, piling on words, piling on words. And you're like,
Yeah.
I don't need all that. And so
Right.
for the listeners, before we started the podcast recording, I was sharing with Dan that we literally wrote the book by hand. I don't mean figuratively. I mean literally with paper and colored pencils.
You still have the stacked paper there?
Yeah, I still. Yeah. So for the listeners, let me grab this. This is the book, and you can see like the pictures that are in the book and the canvases and the way the book is. I'm trying to find the colors and the shading and all that kind of stuff. We would write by hand, tape the images to the wall, take photos, send them to Fede. He had to transcribe our writing, so we learned to write more neatly.
Oh, yeah.
So we would print, and then we would just go iterate. And the end result is this very beautifully created and very useful and easy to access content.
Yeah. So I'm glad. See, I have a plan. So when I do interviews and never quite sure where we're going to dodge and weave, so we which is fine. I'm fine with that. One of the things that you talk about relatively early on is called crossing the chasm model, or the Rogers and Evetts diffusions of innovation, the bell curve of, to me,
Yes.
I always thought about it as adoption. More of my work in the past has been about helping enterprises, executives, managers, employees figure out where they are in the adoption of like a new way of working that's much more collaborative instead of individual contributor centered. So how do you identify the people within your organization that are the innovators, that are the laggards, that are the mainstream? And how do you deal with each of those? Which is, I like to flip things upside down and to use them in inappropriate ways potentially. But there's there's different slices, and I tend to, even for like consumer or B2B facing, selling it to somebody else, I used to think of those slices is that product or solution or service or whatever, is it ready for that slice? But
Right.
When I read in your book that business leaders who can identify the adoption category of the customers are in a better position to design pricing strategies that close sales faster. And that whole close sales faster piece, I thought, holy shit, I haven't thought that would have never occurred to me. So,
Yeah.
it's one is like, so to me, it's potentially that slice. Are they allergic to what you're pitching is sort of how I was thinking about it, or are they ready to adopt it? But that's just one piece. And, and now here we are 15 years or so after business model generation came out. And now we're finally talking about because you understand that segment, you can really speed things up, not just in the development, like agile sense, but in the, how do we make money and how do they derive value?
How do we derive value? How do we make money? I think that there's an important part about the S-shaped curve of adoption or diffusion of innovations from Everett Rogers. There's actually a couple of things that I wanted to add to the book. And it was one of those things where a picture was able to communicate it so much more effectively than a bunch of blah, blah, blah text. The first is, and this is one of the deepest principles in the book, is that pricing evolves over time. The pricing strategy and the price itself has to evolve over time. And the pricing for the adopters, the innovators, so if we want to get the categories right, like the pricing for the innovators, it's when I've done true innovator stuff, sometimes in my enterprise work, it's been like, what do you pay? I just need a sale. Tell me what you need to pay. And then we're going back and forth, and I'm using it to calibrate. But when I hit my early majority, my pricing is set. And when I hit my late majority, I'm probably raising prices because these are the people who are willing to wait. And the other thing I wanted to bring up, Dan, that I think is important is, and I think this gets lost in the traditional literature about diffusion of innovation, is that people assume that an innovator in the adoption category is an innovator about everything in their life. That's
Yep.
not true.
No, right.
It's an individual relationship to a given product or service. In my own personal life, I am an innovator about some things, and I'm actually a laggard about certain things. That leads me to a related concept that I want to point out that we talked about earlier with the difference between software and a pen.
Sure.
In the pen world, the price is kind of a number. It's like, here's your pen. It costs you so much. In the software solution world, pricing isn't a number, it's a system, because that system is going to include things like I can't upgrade this pen. Like, when it's done, it's done. Now, I tend to think of traditional offerings as static.
Yep.
They don't change. And so you start to think about pricing not as a number, but pricing as a system. And that system includes the adopter categories and the strategy. So
Right.
that's one of the really important tenets or theses that guided our writing was pricing is not a number, it's a system, and pricing evolves as the solution evolves.
It's funny because all these books that are in the style that you've pursued, they appear to be really simple on the surface, but there's a lot of depth into it. To have systems that you can actually use to leverage and like do revisions. Like, this is when we launched in Q1 of 2022, this is what we thought our value proposition was, and here's our software, our pricing strategy, and our models and all that stuff. And then, if I was going to go really nuts and think out of the box, how can you pump in simulations that say, hey, what happens if we increase the price here for this one feature or whatever? You could do all sorts of fun stuff. So, and we don't need to give away anything you might be doing.
But that's absolutely a natural. So there's two forms of simulation that you want to be able to use, right? One form of simulation is a simulation to build your own mental model and your own reasoning. One of the things that we talk about in the book is this notion of external triggers. When do I change my pricing? Well, I'm going to change my pricing on one of three things. There's a time-based cadence, meaning if you just put in a clock. If you haven't looked at your pricing at least once a year, you need to do it. Like, just a clock. The second is an internal trigger, and we call that the agency of your own company. I've put out a new release. I've added functionality. I've moved up the adoption curve. When I'm adding all this value, I got to start to decide if I'm going to charge for it. But the third category is external triggers. And we list over 10 different kinds of external triggers. You could have regulatory changes like the CCPA or emerging privacy standards. You could have competitive force triggers. You could have suppliers changing what they're giving you. Something that you were relying on goes away. Or if you're in hardware, if you're a hardware solution, the hardware itself changes. Yeah. And so the concern I have, going back full circle, the concern I have of relying too much of a simulation of your own environment is that by definition, it's what you don't know. And you know that from your innovation background.
Oh, yeah.
That external trigger that you weren't taking account of in the development of your simulation is precisely the weakness that can hurt you the most. So I think simulations that build your mental model, simulations that create common language that enable a group of people to respond to a trigger are very valuable. Simulations that try and say, oh, you're going to put your pricing in and you run the simulation and you're going to get this sale. I'm not as sure yet about those things. Humans need this kind of collaborative model to make these higher price decisions. And the example I use, this isn't in the book, but it's when I'm teaching, is you and I are smart enough, we're experienced enough, and we are fully capable of selling our home on our own if we wanted to sell our home on our own, for sale by owner. Yep. We rarely do that because it's such an important transactions and it's so expensive relative to our net worth that we want a person who's been doing this frequently. Because when we're doing something infrequently, it increases our risk even if we're capable of doing it. And pricing is that way. Even though we talked about in the book that you don't want to go in a fast growing product, you don't want to go more than 6 months. And even in a slow growth product, you don't really want to go longer than a year without revisiting your pricing.
Yep.
But in the Agile community, 1 year is like 7 regular years, right? It's
Yeah.
like dog years.
Yeah, exactly.
And so that's where you need a book like this and some support, because it is infrequent. It's not like managing your backlog or updating your roadmap or getting feedback from your customers or running your daily sprints or your quarterly planning intervals. Your program, right? Your solution, it's going to be more frequent for those kinds of activities. For pricing, it's a little less frequent. So that's when you want to hopefully have our book as a guide. Like, oh, it's been a year. Okay, what do I need to do? Oh, I need to do a snapshot. I need to look at this. I need to look at this. Okay, and if I'm going to make a price change, I need to communicate that. How do I communicate a price change? How do
Yeah.
I communicate packaging? And we go through those processes in the book, because again, it's infrequent. It's not like the release I'm doing every couple of weeks where I'm putting out release notes and like, hey, here's the new version of such and such.
Yeah, even if you're on a relatively fast deployment schedule like Salesforce, does quarterly releases, they have a lot more experience because they do quarterly releases and they've done it for 20 years ish.
Yeah.
They have a lot more experience than than most communications departments or marketing or whoever it is that's doing it. So one thing I like to wrap up on for this podcast, Next Future Today, is it's kind of like the best time to plant a tree was 20 years ago, but hey, you didn't. So you should do that now. So for people that are interested in profit streams for software or for any other things, as for me, I like to play with things outside of the normal realm that they're conceived in.
Mm-hmm.
What should they spend their first 30 minutes on if they wanted to pursue any of the concepts that you talk about in the book?
Well, for us, the foundation of everything is actually doing a customer benefit analysis. And what that means is finding and forcing yourself. Like, sometimes you have to force yourself, like putting a number on economic value or economic structure. And what I mean by that is, let's go back to a different company that we work with a lot. It's weird. I have this barbell structure where I work with a lot of startups and I work with a lot of absolutely huge companies in the Fortune 1000. So going on to the startup side, because their forces are a little less complex because they're not so huge. One of the companies we worked with was Fullcast, and they do revenue operations, and they're growing. And they said something like, well, we can't charge as much as our bigger competitor that I won't name because we don't have as many features or functions as our bigger competitor. In the customer benefit analysis, I said, well, you're overweighting on your tangible benefits or your functional benefits. I said, you've told me that some of the reasons you're making sales is because you're nicer to work with, you're more flexible in your contracts, you're willing to listen, and when customers have a problem, you're willing to adjust, which is a common characteristic of small companies, right? They said, yeah. I said, well, you're discounting that value to zero. And they said, what do you mean? I'm like, those are all intangible benefits of working with Fullcast. And they're like, right. And then I'm like, okay, let me try and make the connection. They're coming to you because you're a nice company to work with that listens and changes your software to better meet your customer needs. You haven't ossified yet. And they're like, oh, is that a benefit? I'm like, yes, this is an intangible benefit and it's worth something.
Yeah.
And they're like, oh, yeah. And so they started to realize that, now, is it hard to put a number on intangible benefits? Sure.
Yep.
Do we do it all the time? It's called goodwill in your balance sheet. It's brand. It's things like that. And so
Yeah.
I think that, Dan, the foundation is a very simple foundation, but it's a very rich foundation. It's understanding what the benefits are. And then what we did in the book, which I'm personally proud of, is we took all of the software Ilities, reliability, maintainability, securability, scalability, and we recast them into current or future economic terms, meaning reliability is an attribute of the Ilities that I care about right now. It's about now. I want a reliable solution. I don't want a reliable solution 5 years from now or next year. I want it right now.
Exactly.
Obviously, extensibility is a future thing. Can I extend the solution in the ways that I need to as I evolve? So one of the things that we've done in the book is and I don't know of any other book that does this, is we've taken all of the Ilities, but we've recast them into these economic structures of now or future. And again, that starts to inform how we price and license our solution in terms of what value we're providing our software. So for people who want to get started and they didn't start with the book, that's okay. Start with your customer benefit analysis, and then from there, a lot of things will fall out.
So, hey, great catching up with you again. Congratulations on software profit streams. It really is. It's interesting that there was this obvious gap that nobody bothered to fill, and you jumped in there, and it is so, like, the more that I read through the book, I was like, oh my God, there's one, wow, and then two, oh my God, there's, like, what I thought I knew about anything was this deep, as it turns out, and then somehow in some beautifully packaged 20, 30 pages, it goes. It's just crazy. So congratulations on synthesizing all that and making it understandable, not just from a simplistic, like, oh, now I understand pricing is a thing. No, there's a lot to it. By the way, here's everything you need to know.
Thank you so much. I mean, we're really happy, really proud, and we cannot wait to get the book into people's hands.
Awesome. All right. Thanks, Luke. Great to catch up, and I'm sure we will be talking again much sooner than our last.
Yes. Thank you, Dan.
Thanks, Luke.